In the stillness that follows confession, when the words of absolution have already been spoken, and the weight of sin has been lifted by the authority of Christ acting through his priest, something unexpected often remains in the human soul. It is not joy, nor full peace, nor immediate certainty. Instead, there is a quiet tension, a lingering awareness that does not seem to match the reality of what has just taken place in the sacrament. The Church teaches that forgiveness is real, objective, and complete when valid confession is made with contrition and absolution is given. Yet the interior experience of the person often tells a different story, and it is here that confusion begins. Many souls leave the confessional believing that something should feel different in an immediate and emotional sense. They expect clarity to flood their interior life, as though grace must announce itself with sensation. But this expectation is not rooted in Catholic theology. It is rooted in modern emotionalism. The sacraments do not operate primarily in the realm of feeling. They operate in the order of objective grace, which is real even when it is not perceived. This distinction is critical for understanding the spiritual life, especially in an age where subjective experience is often mistaken for truth. When Christ instituted the Sacrament of Confession, he did not say, "Whose sins you feel are forgiven, they are forgiven them." He said, "Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them." John 20:23. The authority is external, objective, and juridical. It does not depend on the emotional state of the penitent. And yet, despite this clarity, many Catholics still struggle with doubt immediately after confession, wondering whether God has truly forgiven them because they do not feel forgiven. This struggle is not new. It is part of the human condition wounded by sin, where intellect and will may assent to truth, but the emotions lag behind, still shaped by past disorder. The imagination replays memories. The feelings echo old guilt. And in this interior environment, the enemy of the soul often introduces a subtle suggestion. If you were truly forgiven, you would not feel this way. This is where spiritual discernment becomes essential, because that statement, though persuasive, is not true. The feeling of unrest after confession does not mean forgiveness has not occurred. It often simply means that the interior faculties are still being reordered under grace. The will may have been absolved, but the emotional and imaginative layers of the soul require time to be healed and purified. To understand this properly, one must return to the nature of sin and grace. Mortal sin is not merely a legal violation, it is a disordered act that affects the entire interior structure of the person. When confession restores the soul to grace, it does so immediately in the order of the will. The soul is once again oriented toward God. But the lower faculties, the imagination, memory, and passions, do not instantly conform to this new order. They undergo a gradual healing process. This is why a person can be truly forgiven and still feel sorrow, regret, or even residual guilt. These movements are not evidence of ongoing sin. They are echoes of past disorder being purified. Just as a wound may still ache after it has been treated, so too the soul may still feel the effects of sin even after its guilt has been removed. The Church, in her wisdom, has always distinguished between guilt and consequences. Confession removes guilt entirely, but the temporal effects of sin may remain. This is why penance, prayer, and spiritual discipline continue even after absolution. They are not payment for forgiveness, but cooperation with healing. Yet in modern spiritual life, this distinction is often forgotten. Many expect instant interior silence as proof of grace. When that silence does not come, they begin to question whether the sacrament worked. But this reveals a misunderstanding of how grace operates. Grace is not primarily experienced, it is participated in. It strengthens the will before it calms the emotions. This is why even great saints often experience dryness or interior disturbance after confession or conversion moments. The absence of emotional reassurance did not mean the absence of grace. It meant that grace was working at a deeper level than sensation. One must also understand that the enemy of the soul often exploits this misunderstanding. After confession, when the soul is most vulnerable in its sensitivity, the devil does not usually tempt toward obvious sin. Instead, he tempts toward doubt of forgiveness. Because if he can convince the soul that it is still guilty, he can weaken its confidence, its prayer, and its spiritual momentum. This is why spiritual tradition consistently teaches that trust in God's mercy after confession is itself an act of faith. It is not enough to be absolved. One must also believe in the absolution, not as emotional certainty, but as theological assent. At this stage of the spiritual life, the soul is being invited into a deeper form of faith, one that is not dependent on feeling, but anchored in divine authority. It is easy to believe when peace is felt. It is far more meritorious to believe when peace is absent, but truth remains clear. And so the soul stands in this quiet tension after confession, forgiven, yet still feeling the weight of its past, absolved, yet still remembering what it has done, restored, yet still learning how to live as restored. This is not contradiction, it is formation. For grace does not merely erase the past, it reorders the entire interior life so that even memory becomes purified. But this purification takes time. And in that time, the soul is asked to walk by faith, not by sight, trusting that what God has declared is more real than what the emotions can currently perceive. And yet, beneath this initial struggle, something else begins to emerge, subtle, almost unnoticed at first. Certain interior movements begin to shift, revealing that forgiveness is not only a declaration, but a transformation already quietly underway. S has truly taken effect, is a shift in how the soul perceives sin itself. Before grace, sin is often minimized, rationalized, or compartmentalized. After confession, even if emotional peace is not immediate, something changes in the intellect. Sin begins to appear more clearly as disordered, not merely as regrettable. The soul begins to see with greater clarity that what it once excused was not simply a mistake, but a violation of right order. This clarity is not self-generated. It is a fruit of sanctifying grace beginning to illuminate the intellect. The light of God does not merely forgive, it also reveals. And in that revelation, the soul starts to perceive reality more truthfully than it did before. This is often accompanied not by comfort, but by sobriety. A certain seriousness enters the interior life, not from despair, but from clarity. At the same time, another interior movement begins to appear, resistance to sin. This is one of the most reliable indicators that grace is active. Before confession, habitual sin often flows with little interior resistance. There may be guilt, but there is also ease in returning to the same patterns. After confession, even when the memory of sin remains vivid, something changes in the will. There is interruption, there is hesitation, there is a new interior friction that was not present before. This resistance is not yet perfection. It is the beginning of healing. The will, strengthened by grace, begins to oppose what it once cooperated with. Temptation may still be present, but it is no longer embraced with the same immediacy. A space has been created between stimulus and consent, and in that space, the possibility of virtue begins to grow. This is why the saints often describe the early stages of purification as a battlefield becoming more defined. The fight does not necessarily become easier at first, it becomes clearer. The soul begins to recognize more distinctly where the battle is taking place. And this recognition itself is already a gift of grace. Another important sign, often overlooked, is the gradual return of prayer, not necessarily in consolation, but in fidelity. After confession, even if emotional peace is lacking, many souls find themselves returning to prayer with a certain persistence. It may feel dry, distracted, or even mechanical at first. But the very act of returning is significant. It reveals that the relationship with God has not been severed, but restored. Before grace, prayer often feels like avoidance or burden. After grace, even in dryness, prayer begins to feel like return. The soul may not yet feel God strongly, but it no longer wishes to remain away from Him. This is the quiet beginning of charity reasserting itself within the will. It is also important to note that emotional turbulence after confession does not negate these deeper movements. In fact, emotional instability is often the last layer of the soul to be reordered. The passions, being the most reactive part of human nature, lag behind the intellect and will. They carry memory, habit, and instinct, all of which require time to be purified. This is why a person can sincerely be in a state of grace, while still experiencing waves of sadness, regret, or even interior accusation. These movements are not authoritative. They are residual. They must be acknowledged, but not obeyed. The spiritual life requires learning to distinguish between what is felt and what is true. The tradition of the church consistently teaches that peace is not always immediate, but it is always ordered toward truth. False peace ignores sin. True peace acknowledges forgiveness while remaining sober about weakness. In the early stages after confession, the soul is often being weaned away from emotional dependency and invited into theological trust. At this stage, one of the most dangerous temptations is reinterpretation of confession itself. The soul may begin to question whether it was truly sorry enough, whether the confession was complete enough, or whether something was forgotten. While examination of conscience is always good, obsessive doubt is not. When such thoughts do not lead to clarity but to anxiety, they are not from God. They are distortions that seek to undermine confidence in sacramental grace. Here, obedience to objective truth becomes essential. The Church does not base forgiveness on subjective certainty, but on valid sacramental action. If proper matter, form, and contrition were present, then forgiveness is real, regardless of lingering emotional uncertainty. To doubt this continuously is, in a subtle way, to doubt the efficacy of Christ's promise. And yet, even in this struggle, grace is at work. Because God permits this period of interior adjustment not to torment the soul, but to purify it of reliance on feeling. The soul is being trained to trust God more than itself, more than memory, more than emotion, more than interior narrative. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new foundation begins to form within. A quiet stability that does not depend on fluctuation. It is not yet fully matured, but it is present. The soul begins to realize that its relationship with God is not held together by emotional intensity, but by divine fidelity. And beneath all of this, another deeper transformation is beginning, one that is not immediately visible, but will eventually become unmistakable. The soul is beginning to hate sin, not only for its consequences, but for what it is in itself. And this marks the beginning of a far deeper purification still to come. In the continuing journey of the soul after confession, there arrives a stage that is often misunderstood and therefore often misinterpreted as spiritual failure. It is the moment when forgiveness has already been granted, yet the memory of sin remains vivid, sometimes even more vivid than before. The soul, having been absolved in the sacrament, expects a form of interior silence, as though grace must erase not only guilt, but recollection itself. Yet God does not ordinarily work in this manner. He does not annihilate memory, He purifies it. And in that purification, something far more profound than forgetfulness takes place. Memory in the spiritual life is not neutral. It is a faculty that can either bind the soul to the past or serve as a means of humility and vigilance. Before grace penetrates deeply, memory often functions as a source of accusation. It replays sin not for instruction, but for condemnation. It traps the soul in cycles of regret and self-reproach, suggesting that what has been done defines what the person is. But when forgiveness is received, the objective guilt is removed, and yet the memory remains, now awaiting transformation. This is where the hidden work of God begins. The memory of sin is not erased, but it is gradually stripped of its accusatory power. What once condemned begins to instruct. What once oppressed begins to humble. What once dragged the soul downward begins, paradoxically, to keep it grounded in truth. This transformation is not immediate, and it is rarely perceptible at first. The soul may still feel the emotional weight of past actions, even while intellectually knowing it has been forgiven. Here lies a crucial distinction that must be understood with precision. Remembrance is not the same as guilt. Guilt is a juridical reality that is removed in confession. Remembrance is a psychological and spiritual faculty that remains, but is now subject to grace. To confuse the two is to misunderstand both justice and mercy. The enemy of the soul often exploits this confusion. After confession, he does not typically tempt the soul to repeat sin immediately. Rather, he tempts the soul to reinterpret its interior experience. He whispers that the persistence of memory means persistence of guilt. He suggests that true forgiveness would feel like erasure. And in doing so, he subtly shifts the soul's attention away from the objective truth of the sacrament and toward the instability of subjective experience. This is why discernment is essential. The saints consistently teach that the surest anchor of peace is not memory, but faith in the sacramental order established by Christ. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. John 20:23. There is no conditional clause attached to feeling. There is no requirement of emotional confirmation. The validity of forgiveness does not depend on interior sensation, but on divine authority. And yet, even with this truth firmly established, the soul often undergoes a period of interior purification in which memory itself is slowly reordered. At first, memories of sin may provoke sorrow or embarrassment, but over time, something begins to change. The same memories that once led to despair begin to lead to gratitude. The soul begins to recognize not only what it was freed from, but also how patient God has been throughout its entire history. This shift is subtle but profound. It marks the transition from a memory that accuses to a memory that teaches. The soul no longer says, "This defines me," but rather, "This reveals what I have been delivered from." And in this reorientation, memory itself becomes an instrument of humility rather than condemnation. It is important to note that this purification of memory does not remove emotional residue instantly. The imagination may still replay past actions. Sensory memory may still evoke discomfort, but these movements gradually lose their authority. They no longer dictate identity. They become external rather than defining. At the same time, another interior development begins to emerge, a growing detachment from self-justification. Before grace is fully operative, the soul often instinctively defends itself, either by minimizing sin or by being crushed under it. After confession, however, and as grace deepens, a new interior posture begins to form. The soul no longer feels compelled to explain itself constantly, either to itself or to others. There is a quiet acceptance of truth without distortion. This acceptance is not passivity, it is clarity. The soul begins to see itself as it is without exaggeration, either upward or downward. This is the beginning of authentic humility. Not humiliation, not self-rejection, but truth without embellishment. And in this truth, peace begins to stabilize. Even if emotional fluctuations continue, one of the most important signs that memory is being purified is the change in how the soul responds to past sin when it arises in thought. At first, such memories may still carry emotional sting. But gradually, the reaction changes. Instead of spiraling into despair or anxiety, the soul begins to respond with brief acknowledgement and redirection. There is recognition without fixation, awareness without entanglement. This is a sign that the intellect is gaining authority over the imagination. Grace strengthens the higher faculties so that they can govern the lower ones. The imagination no longer dominates the interior life. It becomes subordinated to truth. This is not suppression, but integration. At this stage, prayer also begins to deepen in a different way, becomes less reactive and more stable. The soul no longer prays primarily out of emotional urgency, but out of habitual orientation toward God. Even when distracted or dry, there is a quiet return, a steady inclination back toward the divine presence. This stability is itself a fruit of purified memory, because the past no longer holds the same binding power. It is also here that the soul begins to understand, often for the first time, that God can use even sin, once forgiven, as a means of deeper humility. Not that sin is good in itself, but that God, in his infinite wisdom, can draw good even from what was evil. The memory of past failure becomes a safeguard against pride. It reminds the soul that it is not self-sufficient, that it is not autonomous, that it is always dependent on mercy. This does not lead to discouragement when properly ordered. Instead, it leads to gratitude. The soul begins to see that it has been preserved, rescued, and restored in ways it could not have achieved on its own. And this recognition slowly transforms the emotional tone of memory itself. What was once painful becomes reverent. And yet, even in this stage of growing clarity, there remains a final interior tension. The soul knows it is forgiven. It sees signs of transformation, and yet it still feels the fragility of its own nature. It begins to ask, not in despair, but in sincerity, how one can be truly stable in grace when weakness still seems so present. This question opens the door to a deeper mystery still unfolding beneath the surface of the spiritual life. In the silence that follows true repentance, the soul often enters a new and deeper struggle that many do not recognize as part of the healing process. After confession, after sorrow, after the firm purpose of amendment, there comes a subtle but powerful question that rises within the heart. But how do I know God has truly forgiven me? This is where many souls lose peace, not because God has withheld his mercy, but because they misunderstand how grace operates in the interior life. The absence of emotional reassurance is not the absence of divine forgiveness. In fact, one of the most important truths in the spiritual life is that God's action is not measured by feeling, but by faith informed by truth. Father Chad Ripperger consistently teaches that certainty of forgiveness does not come through interior consolation, but through the objective reality of the sacrament itself. When the valid conditions are met, true contrition, confession of sins according to species, number, and circumstances, and the priest's absolution, the forgiveness of God, is not in question, the sacraments do not depend on emotional experience. They operate ex opere operato, meaning by the very fact of the action being properly performed. Yet many souls still walk away from confession feeling uncertain, as though something is missing, because they are looking for confirmation in the wrong place. This is where the seventh sign of forgiveness must be understood correctly. A stable will directed away from sin, even if emotions lag behind. A person may still feel shame, sadness, or even temptation after confession, but what matters is whether the will has truly turned back to God. The soul that has been forgiven will, over time, find itself less attached to mortal sin and more resistant to returning to it. This does not mean the struggle disappears, but it does mean the direction of the will has been restored. Grace begins to reorder the interior life quietly, often without immediate awareness. Another sign that is often misunderstood is the gradual return of peace. not as emotional excitement, but as stability in the conscience. This peace is not the absence of battle, but the absence of condemnation. Many confuse guilt with contrition, but they are not the same. Guilt that remains after confession is often not from God, but from either unresolved attachment or demonic accusation. The enemy does not respect sacramental grace. He attempts to convince the soul that forgiveness was incomplete or invalid. This is why spiritual discernment is essential after confession, because not every interior voice is trustworthy. Father Ripperger emphasizes that one of the most dangerous traps after confession is re-examining forgiven sins as though God's judgment were incomplete. This practice is not humility. It is a subtle form of spiritual doubt. True humility accepts both one's sinfulness and God's authority to forgive it. Once absolution is given, the proper response is not continued interrogation of oneself, but trust in the divine judgment already rendered. To doubt forgiveness after valid confession is, in a sense, to place one's own judgment above the Church's authority and Christ's institution of the sacrament. The sixth sign of forgiveness, often overlooked, is the weakening of habitual sin over time. Grace does not only cleanse, it strengthens. A soul that has been truly absolved begins to notice that the same temptations no longer carry the same force they once did. There may still be struggle, but the interior gravity towards sin is reduced. This is not psychological conditioning alone. It is the infusion of sanctifying grace, repairing the damaged faculties of the soul. Where sin once dominated imagination, memory, and desire, grace slowly begins to reestablish order. Yet this process is not linear. Many are surprised to find that after confession, temptations may temporarily intensify. This is not a sign of failed forgiveness, but of spiritual warfare. When grace increases, resistance often increases as well. The enemy does not retreat quietly. He attempts to reassert influence. This is why perseverance in prayer, mortification, and vigilance is necessary. Forgiveness is instantaneous in the sacrament, but sanctification unfolds over time. The fifth sign is often the most difficult for modern souls to accept: the presence of a deeper desire for God, even if faint. After confession, even in dryness, the soul begins to experience a subtle orientation toward prayer, truth, and holiness. It may not feel dramatic. It may even be barely noticeable. But the direction changes. The mind begins to return to God more frequently. The conscience becomes more sensitive to sin. The heart, though still wounded, becomes less satisfied with the world. This interior movement is one of the clearest indicators that grace is active. God does not always announce his forgiveness with emotion, but he always leaves evidence in the transformation of the will. The soul that once ran easily toward sin now hesitates. The soul that once avoided prayer now returns, even reluctantly. These are not accidents. They are the quiet fingerprints of divine mercy reshaping a fallen nature. At this stage, Father Ripperger often warns against spiritual impatience. Many souls expect immediate perfection after confession, and when they do not experience it, they assume something has gone wrong. But the spiritual life is not a single moment of healing. It is a process of purification. God forgives instantly, but he heals progressively. The distinction is essential. Forgiveness restores friendship with God. Healing restores the capacity to live that friendship fully. And so the soul must learn to live in this paradox, fully forgiven yet still being transformed, fully absolved yet still being purified. This is the normal Catholic life. The saints did not become holy because they never sinned, but because they learned how to respond correctly after sin. They trusted not in their feelings, but in the sacramental authority of Christ acting through his church. As this understanding deepens, the soul begins to rest not in self-assurance, but in divine assurance. And in that quiet place, where doubt loses its authority and grace begins to govern the interior life, the heart becomes ready for the final movement of this teaching. The last and most decisive signs that God has truly forgiven, not only in words, but in the full reordering of the soul toward eternity. In the final movement of the spiritual journey we have been tracing, the soul is brought to a place where understanding must mature into surrender. After confession, after signs of interior change, after the gradual weakening of sin and the quiet return of peace, there remains one last and decisive question that often lingers in the human heart. If God has forgiven me, why do I still feel unworthy? This question reveals something important not about God's mercy, but about the soul's lingering attachment to self-judgment. Father Chad Ripperger consistently teaches that one of the most subtle deceptions after confession is the refusal to accept the completeness of God's forgiveness. The sacrament does not merely cover sin, it removes it. Yet the imagination often lags behind reality, replaying past failures as though they still define the present state of the soul. This is where faith must take precedence over memory. What God has absolved, he no longer judges. To continue judging oneself beyond confession is to live as though Christ's authority were incomplete. The final sign of forgiveness, therefore, is not emotional certainty, but the stabilization of trust. The soul begins, slowly and often imperfectly, to rest in what the Church has declared rather than what feelings suggest. This is a profound shift in interior life. The person who once depended on emotional reassurance begins to depend on sacramental reality. Even in dryness, even in temptation, even in moments of confusion, the soul returns to a simple truth. God has spoken through his Church, and his word is not uncertain. Another deep sign appears in the way memory itself begins to heal. The forgiven soul no longer relives sin with fascination or despair, but with detachment and sobriety. The past does not disappear, but it loses its emotional authority. It becomes something acknowledged, confessed, and offered to God's mercy, rather than something repeatedly reopened. This detachment is not forgetfulness. It is freedom. It is the beginning of what the saints describe as interior liberty, the ability to remember without being enslaved. At this stage, the enemy often attempts one final strategy: discouragement disguised as humility. The soul may begin to think, others are holier than I am, or God surely must be disappointed in me. But Father Ripperger warns that this is not humility, it is inverted pride. True humility agrees with reality. I am a sinner who has been forgiven by a merciful God. False humility denies the effectiveness of that mercy. It is a refusal to accept grace under the appearance of unworthiness. The soul must therefore learn a difficult but essential discipline: to reject false interior accusations, even when they feel spiritually safe. Not every thought of unworthiness comes from God. Some are temptations to distrust his mercy. The saints did not become holy by endlessly questioning forgiveness, but by firmly accepting it and then moving forward in obedience, prayer, and penance. Another final sign of forgiveness is perseverance in the spiritual life despite interior dryness. Many expect that forgiveness will produce constant consolation, but in reality, God often leads the forgiven soul into periods of purification where feelings are minimal. This is not abandonment, it is maturation. The soul is being taught to love God for who he is, not for what is felt. This is a deeper form of charity, one that is stable, not emotional. In this hidden work of grace, something profound happens. The will becomes more consistent than emotion. Prayer continues even without consolation. Virtue is pursued even without immediate reward. Sin is resisted not because it feels repulsive, but because it is known to be offensive to God. This is the beginning of mature spiritual life, the point where love is no longer dependent on sensation, but grounded in truth. Father Ripperger often reminds the faithful that assurance of forgiveness is not a mystical feeling to be sought, but a theological certainty to be believed. Christ instituted the Sacrament of Confession precisely so that souls would not be trapped in uncertainty. To doubt after valid absolution is, in effect, to seek another authority higher than Christ's own ordinance. This is why trust in the sacrament is not optional. It is an act of faith. And so the journey ends where it truly begins, in trust. The soul that has been forgiven must now live as one who is forgiven, not perfectly, not without struggle, but without denial of grace. The past remains acknowledged, but no longer dominant. The present becomes a place of obedience. The future becomes an offering. In the end, the greatest sign that God has forgiven a soul is not that it feels flawless, but that it returns to Him again and again. After failure, after weakness, after temptation, it returns. Because grace has reestablished what sin once disrupted, the direction of the heart toward God. And in that quiet return, repeated through days and years, the truth becomes undeniable. Forgiveness is not an emotion to be felt, but a reality to be lived. The soul that persists in returning, in trusting, in confessing, and in striving is already living inside the mercy it once questioned. That is the final sign. Not perfection, but perseverance in grace.